I never imagined the first person to physically attack me after leaving the army wouldn't be an enemy in a war zone, but the president of my own HOA. The moment still replays in my mind like a broken film reel, sharp, jarring, and impossible to forget. The board meeting room was packed that night. Bodies squeezed shoulder to shoulder, whispers bouncing off the beige walls. I'd only come to dispute the bogus violations the HOA kept slapping on my door, but within minutes, everything spiraled so violently that even the bravest neighbors froze where they sat. I was sitting near the end of the long conference table when it happened. Marjorie Blake, our HOA president, marched toward me with the kind of fury I'd only seen in people about to do something irreversible. Her face was flushed red, her eyes shaking with outrage, and everyone around us went silent, sensing something was about to snap. I tried to stay calm, my hand resting over the cool metal of my prosthetic limb hidden under my pant leg. I dealt with confrontation before. I dealt with worse. But nothing prepares you for being humiliated in front of your entire neighborhood. Her voice sliced through the air so sharply it made a few people gasp. I'm not letting you scam this community anymore. You're not disabled. You're a fraud manipulating the system. I felt every head in the room turn toward me, heat rising to my face as if someone had pressed a branding iron against my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a single word, she lunged forward. Her nails hooked into my pant leg, digging in so forcefully that I jerked back instinctively. The chair screeched against the laminate floor as my body slammed into it, the impact shooting a fierce stabbing pain up the socket where my prosthetic connected. My heart thundered in my chest, a chaotic mix of shock and adrenaline, and for a moment the room blurred as the fluorescent lights flashed too brightly overhead. She kept pulling harder, faster, desperately trying to expose me. "Show everyone your real leg," she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. The metal inside my prosthetic scraped sharply as she yanked, and the sound clawed straight into my nerves. I could feel my breath faltering. The humiliation was suffocating. I'd survived explosions overseas. I'd survived seeing friends fall beside me. But this? Being torn apart in front of neighbors I'd hoped to befriend? It cut deeper than I expected. Some people stood halfway, unsure if they should help or stay out of it, their hesitation thick in the air. Others covered their mouths, frozen in disbelief. Not a single person moved fast enough. In that moment, I was caught between shame and rising anger. An anger that had been building for weeks as the HOA targeted me again and again, all because of a disability I never asked for. My voice trembled with frustration as I tried to push her away. "Stop, Marjorie, stop." But she didn't. Hear me. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She was too consumed by whatever hatred or suspicion she'd built up in her mind. Finally, two security volunteers rushed in from the doorway. They grabbed her arms, pulling her back as she twisted and fought against them. Chairs toppled, papers scattered across the floor, and the entire meeting erupted into chaos. For a second, I thought it was over. But as they tried to restrain her, she lunged again, reaching for my prosthetic with a look in her eyes that sent ice straight through me. And that was when I realized things were far worse than I ever imagined. I survived an explosion overseas. I never expected to fear my own neighborhood. That thought kept repeating in my mind as I sat alone in my living room the night after Marjorie tried to rip my prosthetic leg off in front of everyone. It was a strange kind of pain, a mix of betrayal, humiliation, and exhaustion. I'd fought for my country. I'd survived losing a limb. I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece. Yet here, in a quiet suburban community where I thought I'd finally rest, I felt more targeted than I ever did on active duty. The road that brought me here was long, too long. I still remember the blast that took my leg. 1 second of blinding light, heat, and sound that erased everything familiar. I remember waking up in the hospital, gripping the sheets, wondering what part of my life was left. Rehab was brutal. Learning how to walk again on a prosthetic felt like being reborn into a body that didn't quite fit anymore. But I pushed through. Not because I was strong, but because I didn't know any other way to survive. After years of fighting, healing, and trying to build some version of normal again, I decided to start over completely. I wanted a fresh beginning, far away from military hospitals and the reminders of everything I'd lost. So when I found this HOA community, quiet streets, tree-lined sidewalks, neighbors who waved at each other, it felt like a promise. A place where I could finally breathe without constantly watching my back. The house I chose was small but comfortable, and it offered exactly what I needed: simplicity. My doctor recommended a unit close to accessible parking, and I was relieved to see the community had designated ADA spaces right near my building. I also planned to install a small ramp to reduce strain on my knee, since even a slight misstep could send a shock of pain through the prosthetic socket. It wasn't special treatment. It was survival. The first day I moved in, I tried to soak in the peace I'd been craving. Kids rode bikes on the sidewalk. Someone watered their garden. A golden retriever ran circles around its owner. For a moment, I felt normal. Just a guy moving into a new home. And then I saw her. Marjorie Blake stood across the cul-de-sac, arms crossed, expression sharp as broken glass. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't even blink. She looked me up and down like she was scanning for flaws. Her eyes lingered on my leg, or what she thought was my leg. Even through my pants, even with my prosthetic moving smoothly, she watched me as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just curious. Maybe she was having a bad day. I'd dealt with far worse personalities in the army, so one unfriendly neighbor didn't bother me much. In fact, I told myself I was overthinking it. Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt. But the doubt didn't stay gone for long. On my second morning in the neighborhood, before the sun was even fully up, I opened my front door and froze. Plastered on the wood was a bright orange slip, taped aggressively at eye level like a warning sign, a violation notice. My heart sank as I pulled it off and read the words that would mark the beginning of everything that followed: unauthorized use of a restricted parking space. It was 6 a.m., and I had parked in the designated ADA spot the night before, exactly where I belonged. She looked me up and down and said I walked too normally to deserve the disabled spot. Those were the first real words Marjorie Blake ever spoke directly to me, and they hit harder than any blow I'd taken overseas. I had just stepped outside to grab a package from my porch when she marched toward me across the gravel, heels clicking sharply like she wanted the whole neighborhood to hear her coming. The early morning air was cool, but the moment she opened her mouth, heat crawled up the back of my neck. "What you're doing is dishonest," she snapped, stopping so close I could smell her perfume. Sharp, chemical, suffocating. "That parking space is for people who are actually disabled." Her tone wasn't curious or concerned. It was accusatory, cold. Like she'd already held a trial in her mind and found me guilty. I blinked at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "Ma'am, I am disabled. I have a prosthetic leg." I lifted my pant leg slightly, enough to reveal the bottom of the metal hardware. Not enough for her to grab, just enough to show I wasn't lying. But instead of backing down, she smirked. An ugly, condescending smirk that made my stomach twist. "Convenient," she said, crossing her arms. "Anyone can buy something like that online these days. Doesn't mean you deserve special privileges." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "I lost my leg serving this country. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm using the spot that's legally reserved for me." She leaned in closer, and the scent of her perfume stung my nose like paint thinner. "You walk too normally," she hissed. "Real disabled people don't move like you. So unless you're willing to prove it, you need to park somewhere else." Behind her, I noticed neighbors slowly drifting onto their porches, pretending to sip coffee or check their mail but clearly watching the confrontation unfold. None of them said a word. No one stepped forward. The silence pressed against my chest heavier than the accusation itself. I tried to keep calm, even as my pulse hammered against my ribs. Confrontation never scared me, but humiliation did, and the way she spoke, loudly and with absolute certainty, made it feel like she was peeling away my dignity, one cruel sentence at a time. "I'm not proving anything to you," I said firmly. "My medical history isn't your business. My placard is legitimate. End of story." For a moment, something dark flickered across her face. Anger, maybe embarrassment, maybe both. She straightened up, lifting her chin with that haughty superiority she wore like a uniform. "Then you'll explain yourself at the HOA board hearing," she said. "Refusing to cooperate only makes you look more suspicious." I stared at her, incredulous. "A hearing? For what?" "For lying," she answered simply, as if it were a fact. More neighbors had gathered now. Some leaned against porch railings, others stood behind screen doors. All watching. No one helping. A familiar tension formed in my chest, the same tightness I used to feel before stepping into unknown territory. Except this wasn't a battlefield in the Middle East. This was a cul-de-sac in suburban America. Marjorie turned to leave, but before she walked away, she stepped closer, so close her voice brushed my ear like frost. "You'll regret lying in my neighborhood," she whispered. Then she walked off, leaving the gravel crunching under her heels while the rest of the street stood frozen, pretending they hadn't heard every word. And for the first time since moving in, I felt something that had nothing to do with the heat of the day or the sting of her perfume. I felt danger. By sunrise, 3 new violation letters were slapped on my door like threats. The sound of them fluttering in the early morning breeze woke me before my alarm did. For a moment, half asleep, I thought it was the wind tapping against the frame. But when I opened the door and saw the neon-colored papers plastered across the wood, my stomach dropped. 1 violation was stressful. 3 in one night felt like an ambush. The first letter accused me, again, of unauthorized use of a restricted parking space, even though my disabled placard hung clearly from my rearview mirror. The second claimed my portable entry ramp violated community design standards because its color clashed with neighborhood aesthetics. The ramp was gray. Just plain neutral gray. The same shade used on half the houses on the block. And the third violation was the most insulting one yet. Improper medical equipment display. I stared at that line for a full minute, disbelief twisting into anger. What medical equipment? My leg? Was my prosthetic now a violation? I stood there on my porch, 3 papers in hand, trying to swallow a rising bitterness. It wasn't subtle anymore. This wasn't oversight or miscommunication. This was harassment. Organized, deliberate, and relentless. Each letter carried a potential fine. $50 here, $75 there, another 100 tacked on for repeat infractions. They added up fast. Too fast. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't irresponsible. I'd budgeted carefully for this new beginning, believing this community would give me the quiet stability I desperately needed. Instead, it felt like the HOA had declared war on me. Every day after that, something new appeared. Fresh violations taped to my door, emails sent at dawn, letters stuffed into my mailbox with bold red print. The stress clung to me like humidity in summer, thick and inescapable. I started waking up earlier just to check if something else had been posted on my door before the rest of the neighborhood was awake. My mornings no longer began with coffee, but with dread. Financially, the pressure built like a tightening vice. Emotionally, it was worse. I felt watched, judged, targeted for existing differently than everyone else. Neighbors who once waved from across the street now avoided eye contact. A few whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. I'd fought enemies I could see. This invisible hostility was something entirely different. One afternoon, after receiving my 7th violation of the week, I finally called a veteran support line. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and familiar in a way I hadn't felt since leaving the service. I explained everything: my injury, my prosthetic, the harassment, The HOA president's behavior. The counselor listened without interrupting, then told me something simple but powerful. Document everything. And so I did. I took photos, saved emails, recorded conversations, logged times and dates, even wrote down comments from neighbors who had seen Marjorie watching my house from her porch. If this was a fight, I needed evidence. Not fists, not anger, proof. Days passed, and the pile of violations grew thicker. The sense of being cornered settled deeper into my bones. And then, just when I thought the harassment had reached its peak, a different kind of envelope arrived. A formal, certified letter from the HOA. Bold print across the top read, "Mandatory appearance, compliance review." As I held it in my hands, a cold realization washed over me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. They were gearing up for something bigger. Every board member stared at me as if they'd already found me guilty. That was the first thing I felt when I walked into the HOA hearing room. Judgment. Heavy, unspoken, suffocating. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a faint static that crawled along my nerves, and the cold air from the vents blew directly onto my neck, making my skin prickle. The room was packed, far more crowded than I expected for a simple compliance review. Neighbors lined the walls, some leaning on chairs, others clutching their phones as if they were waiting for entertainment. I took a seat at the long table facing the board. 5 members sat there, stiff-backed, arms crossed, eyes sharp. And in the center, like a queen presiding over her court, sat Marjorie Blake. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were already burning holes through me. "Let's begin," she said, her voice dripping with authority she hadn't earned but forced everyone to obey. Before I could say a word, she slid a stack of violation notices across the table toward me. They fanned out like a hand of cards in a rigged game. "These are the repeated offenses you've committed since moving into our community. Parking fraud, unauthorized structural additions, misrepresentation of disability status." I blinked, stunned. Parking fraud? Misrepresentation. But the moment I opened my mouth, she cut me off with a raised hand. "Do not interrupt the board," she commanded, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. I tried again, more calmly. "I didn't misrepresent anything. I have documentation." "Forged documentation?" she said, arching one eyebrow with theatrical disbelief. "We've had cases of that before. People pretending to be disabled for benefits and privileges. It happens everywhere." The accusation punched the air from my lungs. Forgery. She wasn't just calling me a liar. She was painting me as a criminal. I reached into my folder, pulling out the letter from the state confirming my disability placard. "This is from the DMV." She leaned forward, interrupting again. "A printed letter? Anyone can create one. That doesn't prove anything." A murmur rippled through the room. I noticed a few neighbors lifting their phones higher, pretending to scroll but clearly recording the exchange. Their faces weren't hostile, just curious, like they were watching a courtroom drama unfold in real time. My hands clenched under the table. I kept my voice steady, though every muscle in my body wanted to snap. "I also have my medical documentation. And my prosthetic." "Oh, we know about your supposed prosthetic," she said with a smug smile. "You walk far too naturally for it to be real. I've seen fully disabled individuals. You're not one of them." Fully disabled. The phrase tore through me like shrapnel. She spoke as if disability had to be visible, dramatic, grotesque, like pain only counted if it was on full display for her approval. Every sentence I tried to finish, she sliced apart. Every fact I offered, she twisted. The room wasn't a hearing, it was an interrogation, and Marjorie wasn't seeking truth. She was seeking validation for a narrative she'd already decided was real. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of her accusations, she sat back with a victorious smile, her voice dropping into something colder, calculated, and deeply unsettling. Given your refusal to provide convincing proof, she said, I may need to physically confirm the accuracy of your claim at a later date. The room went dead silent. Physically confirm? A chill crept down my spine. And the worst part was the look on her face. She meant it. That night, I realized I wasn't fighting an HOA. I was fighting a tyrant. The hearing had left me drained in a way I hadn't felt since the early days of rehab, when every step reminded me I wasn't whole anymore. Sitting alone at my kitchen table, stacks of violation notices spread around me like scattered battle reports. I felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Not fear, not anger, something colder. The understanding that Marjorie wasn't just enforcing rules. She was enforcing her rule, and people like her didn't care about fairness or laws. They cared about control. But I hadn't survived war, just a surrender to a suburban dictator. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about disability rights in HOA-governed communities. The ADA was clear. Reasonable accommodations were not optional. A homeowner with a disability had the right to accessible parking, ramps, and modifications necessary for mobility. State law echoed the same protections, reinforcing that HOAs had zero authority to override federal disability standards. The more I read, the more it became obvious. What Marjorie was doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. One line from a legal article hit me like a punch to the chest. Harassment based on disability is actionable under both federal and state law. I sat back, exhaling slowly. She wasn't just harassing me socially. She was violating my civil rights. Still, information wasn't enough. I needed guidance. So the next morning, I called a veterans legal service I'd been referred to years ago, but never needed until now. Within an hour, an attorney named Richard called me back. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had dealt with 1,000 HOA battles and won 900 of them. After listening carefully to everything, the violations, the accusations, the hearing, the attempts to discredit my prosthetic, he let out a long breath. You have a rock-solid case, he said. What she's doing is not just harassment, it's discriminatory, and it violates multiple federal protections. He instructed me to gather everything: emails, violation notices, photos, recordings from neighbors, even the details from the hearing. Start documenting her behavior daily, he added. If she's targeting you, the pattern will be obvious. HOAs get away with things because people give up. Don't give up. I promised I wouldn't. For the next few days, I became meticulous. Every violation got photographed, every interaction logged, every suspicious glance or comment noted. I gathered medical letters, disability credentials, and proof of my prosthetic's authenticity, not because I owed Marjorie anything, but because I wanted to walk into the next fight ready. Piece by piece, my defense took shape, and with it, a strange sense of strength returned. Not physical strength, not military strength, something quieter, but equally powerful: conviction. But of course, Marjorie sensed I was preparing for something. Bullies always have a sixth sense when their victim is no longer weak. So she struck first. It happened on the weekend, at a neighborhood barbecue I almost didn't attend. I thought keeping my distance would give me peace, but I also didn't want to show her she'd driven me into isolation. So I went, choosing a spot by the grill, keeping to myself, trying to enjoy a normal moment. The smell of charcoal, kids laughing, the low rumble of casual conversation. For a few minutes, I almost felt human again. Then the crowd shifted. Conversations fell quiet, and before I could turn around, I heard her voice behind me. Soft, cold, venom wrapped in silk. "We need to talk," she whispered. She had cornered me, and the look in her eyes told me the fight was about to get uglier than ever. She pointed at me and shouted, "You're not disabled. Prove it." The moment her voice cut through the barbecue chatter, the entire atmosphere shifted. Conversations fell silent mid-sentence. Children stopped playing, their hands frozen over half-built sandcastles and dripping popsicles. Even the smoke drifting from the grill seemed to hesitate, hanging thick in the warm air like it didn't want to move and draw attention. I felt every eye turn toward me, some confused, some curious, some already judging. My stomach twisted painfully, not from fear, but from the deep familiar sting of humiliation. I had survived being blown apart overseas, but somehow, being accused of faking the aftermath hurt more than I could explain. Marjorie didn't give me a second to breathe. She walked toward me slowly, deliberately, circling me like an interrogator studying a suspect. Her heels dug into the grass with little thuds that felt like countdowns. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think they've cornered their prey. "This man," she announced loudly, gesturing toward me with a flourish, "has been lying to this community since the day he moved in. He's been stealing privileges from real disabled homeowners." Murmurs spread through the gathering, sharp, prickling whispers that crawled across my skin like needles. Someone gasped. Someone else mumbled, "Seriously?" A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what to believe. I lifted my hands slightly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Marjorie, you need to stop. This isn't the time or place." "Oh, so now you want privacy," she snapped. "Why? Because you know you're lying?" She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. I could smell freshly applied makeup, mixed with the sharp bite of the wine she'd been drinking. "Go on, show everyone the leg you claim you have." My jaw clenched. "You don't get to demand that." She laughed. A cold, sharp laugh that made a few people look away. "Of course he won't show us, because there's nothing to show." She turned to the crowd. "He's perfectly fine. I've seen him walk without limping. I've seen him carry boxes. Real disabled people can't do that." Her words felt like bullets, each one hitting a place I thought had healed. I wanted to explain. I wanted to pull her aside and avoid the spectacle. But with every attempt to speak, she only grew louder. "Marjorie," I said through gritted teeth, "you're embarrassing yourself. Please stop." "Oh, you're worried about embarrassment?" she said mockingly. "Then prove it. Show me the leg." A few neighbors shook their heads, obviously uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward. No one told her to back off. I wasn't surprised anymore. People like Marjorie thrived because most people preferred looking away rather than intervening. She began circling me again, her eyes roaming from my hip to my ankle with predatory intent. Then, without warning, she jabbed her finger into my thigh, right above the socket where my prosthetic connected. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and immediate. "See?" she said triumphantly. "He didn't even react like someone with a real prosthetic would. He's lying." I took a step back, jaw trembling with anger. "Do not touch me again." But she only smirked, leaning closer. "Why? Worried I'll expose you?" The tension around us tightened like a noose. Everyone knew something was about to snap. And then it happened. Her expression changed, hardening into determination, and before I could brace myself, she suddenly reached for my pant leg. And I knew in that instant she was about to cross a line she couldn't come back from. Her fingernails hooked under my pant leg. Then she pulled. Hard. So hard that for a split second, I didn't understand what was happening. All I felt was a jolt. A violent, wrenching twist that shot up through the prosthetic socket and into the sensitive bone where my real leg ended. The pain was instant, sharp, and blinding, like someone had clamped a hot iron around my knee and yanked with everything they had. My balance gave out immediately. The grass beneath me tilted, the world spinning sideways as Marjorie's grip tightened. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. The sky blurred overhead, bright and unfocused, while voices around me exploded into shouts. "What is she doing? Stop her! Oh my God, someone get her off him!" But she didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. She pulled again, her nails digging through fabric, her hands clawing viciously at the connection point of my prosthetic. The metal twisted unnaturally, sending another bolt of agony up my leg. My fingers dug into the grass as I tried to brace myself, but she was relentless. fueled by something far darker than anger. "See? See!" she screamed, spit flying, her face twisted with a rage that didn't look human anymore. "It's fake. He's faking it. There's nothing wrong with him." I tried to push myself upright, tried to pry her hands off, but the awkward angle and the pain made it impossible. Every tug felt like she was peeling the skin off a wound that hadn't healed. My breath came out in strangled bursts as I fought to stay calm, but the humiliation hit almost as hard as the physical pain. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, neighbors, parents, kids, watching me struggle on the ground like some spectacle. "Stop! Marjorie, stop!" someone finally shouted. Two men rushed forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. It took both of them to pull her away, and even then, she thrashed and kicked, reaching out toward my leg as if she were possessed. One of the men nearly lost his grip when she twisted violently, shrieking, "He's lying! He's lying! Let me prove it!" A woman knelt beside me, her voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help? Someone call the police." "I already did," another voice called out. "They're on their way." The sounds melted together. Pounding footsteps, panicked whispers, the distant ring of a phone call ending. The smell of smoke from the grill mixed with the sharp scent of trampled grass. I forced myself into a sitting position, my hands trembling as I inspected the prosthetic. The outer shell was scratched and slightly loosened from the force, but thankfully still attached. My leg, however, throbbed violently inside the socket, every pulse of pain reminding me how close she'd come to injuring me permanently. The two men restraining her dragged her back several feet, but she kept fighting, her voice echoing across the entire neighborhood. "He's a fraud. He's pretending. He's stealing from this community." No one believed her anymore. I could see it in their faces: shock, disgust, disbelief. The truth had finally cracked through her delusion, but she refused to let go. And then, cutting through the chaos, came the distant wail of sirens. Marjorie jerked against the men's hold, her voice rising into a screech that sent chills down my spine. "Arrest him!" she howled, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Arrest him!" As the sirens grew, louder, echoing through our quiet neighborhood, I realized the nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was about to reach its breaking point. The officer asked me to lift my pant leg, and the entire street went silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, stretching across the neighborhood like a thick blanket. Even the kids who had been crying moments earlier stopped mid-sob, their eyes wide as they clung to their parents' legs. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows, casting sharp colors across the shocked faces staring at me. I pulled the fabric up slowly, my hands trembling from pain and adrenaline. The metal of my prosthetic caught the light. Cold, unmistakable, undeniable. The socket, the straps, the connecting hardware. All of it fully visible. I didn't have to say a word. The truth spoke for itself. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm expression, exhaled quietly. "All right," he said, nodding. "I see." Behind him, Marjorie's confidence evaporated. Her face, flushed moments ago with self-righteous fury, drained of color. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly, from me, to the officers, to the neighbors whose expressions were no longer supportive, but horrified. She looked like someone watching their last defense crumble to dust. A neighbor stepped forward, voice shaking with anger. "Officer," she attacked him. She grabbed his leg. She tried to pull it off. We all saw it. Another neighbor held up their phone. I recorded the entire thing. Within seconds, 3 more people offered videos, photos, and statements. People who had been too afraid to intervene earlier now spoke with conviction, their voices overlapping. She kept screaming at him. She wouldn't stop touching him. She knocked him to the ground. The officers listened carefully, taking notes, asking calm, controlled questions. Every word from the neighbors strengthened my case, painting a clear picture of what had really happened. Meanwhile, Marjorie stood in denial, her hands shaking as she pointed at random people. "They're lying," she shouted. "All of them. They're covering for him. He's manipulating the entire neighborhood." But no one backed her. Not a single person nodded. Not one voice rose to support her. The officer closest to her tilted his head. "Ma'am, several witnesses have provided consistent accounts of you physically grabbing him." "That's because he tricked them," she screeched, her voice cracking. "He's pretending. That leg isn't real. He's scamming us." The officer raised an eyebrow and gestured toward my prosthetic. "Ma'am, it is real. We're looking at it." Something in her broke then. Her shoulders sagged, her expression twisted into something desperate and frightened. She took a shaky step backward, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "You don't understand. He's lying. He's lying." But the officers weren't listening anymore. They were focused on me. One of them kneeled slightly, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" "I'll be okay," I said, though my leg throbbed fiercely inside the socket. He nodded. "We're going to file a full incident report. Based on what we've seen and heard, it's clear you're the victim here." Victim. The word hit harder than I expected. Not because it wasn't true, but because I hated feeling like one. The officers moved toward Marjorie then, two of them positioning themselves at her sides. She backed away, horrified. "You're arresting the wrong person. Arrest him. He attacked me." But no one believed her. Not anymore. Not after everything. As they prepared to take her statement and possibly restrain her if she kept resisting, the officer beside me leaned in slightly. His tone softened. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" And just like that, the entire street seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for my answer. I didn't want revenge, but I couldn't let her attack another veteran. That thought settled heavily in my chest as the officer waited for my answer. My leg was throbbing, my pride was bruised, and humiliation clung to my ribs like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I hadn't moved into this neighborhood to fight battles. I came here to heal, to breathe, to feel like a normal man again. But what Marjorie did wasn't just harassment. It was an assault. And walking away would only guarantee she'd target someone else the moment I wasn't there to stop her. So I made my choice. "Yes," I said, finally meeting the officer's eyes. "I'm pressing charges." The officer nodded with a kind of solemn understanding, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. From that moment on, the tone of the night shifted. Statements were taken, videos were collected, and neighbors who had stood in silence for weeks now stepped forward one by one to offer their support. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner. Others admitted they'd been intimidated by Marjorie for months, afraid of becoming targets themselves. That night I emailed Richard, the veteran's attorney who had advised me earlier. By morning, he had already scheduled a call with an ADA advisor and outlined the steps we needed to take. The moment we connected, he didn't waste time. "I'm proud of you for pressing charges," he said. "People like her thrive on silence. You set a boundary she can't ignore." We spent hours going over every detail, from the physical assault at the barbecue to the campaign of violations she had been piling on me since I moved in. Each notice, each email, each confrontation, every piece mattered. The ADA advisor chimed in with additional insights, explaining that the HOA's actions weren't just morally wrong, they were legally indefensible. I created a folder on my desktop called HOA Case, and each day it grew thicker. Videos from neighbors, screenshots of emails, voicemails from the HOA office, photos of my damaged prosthetic shell, a handwritten log of every humiliation, every comment made in front of others, every attempt she'd made to discredit my disability. The process was draining, emotionally and mentally. Some nights I sat at my dining table long after midnight, papers spread around me, wondering how everything had spiraled so quickly. I wasn't a confrontational man. I never wanted to use the law as a weapon. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look on her face as she clawed at my leg. How she genuinely believed she had the right to expose me, harm me, humiliate me. Fear battled with justice constantly inside me. Some mornings I woke questioning whether taking this to court was the right move. Other mornings I woke angry, furious that someone could treat me that way and expect to walk away without consequences. The emotional pendulum swung hard, but with every swing, I felt myself getting stronger, more certain. Neighbors checked in often now. Some brought coffee. Others offered to testify. A few, ones I'd never even spoken to, stopped by just to tell me they supported me. Their kindness softened some of the frustration embedded in my chest. Weeks passed, and finally, the court date arrived. I stood outside the courthouse that morning, suit pressed, prosthetic fitted snugly, heart pounding in my chest. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the sky hung low with gray clouds that made the building look more imposing. When I walked into the courtroom, my pulse hammered. Marjorie was already seated at the defendant's table. Her shoulders were rigid, her breathing shallow. But what hit me hardest wasn't her presence. It was the fact that, as I approached my seat, she refused to look at me. Not once, not even for a second. 10 minutes of evidence was all it took to erase her entire reign. That's how quickly the courtroom shifted. From tension, from suspense, from uncertainty, into a cold, undeniable truth that not even Marjorie could outrun. The moment the prosecutor pressed play on the first video, the room fell silent. The screen lit up with the footage from the barbecue. Me standing near the grill, her circling me like a predator, her shouting accusations, and then, unmistakably, her grabbing my pant leg and yanking with both hands. The audio was painfully clear. "Show everyone your real leg. See, it's fake. He's lying." Each word echoed through the courtroom like a confession. Marjorie's face drained of color. She looked smaller somehow, sinking back into her chair as if the weight of her actions finally collapsed onto her shoulders. Her attorney shifted uncomfortably, already sensing the case was slipping away. Then came the witnesses. One by one, neighbors stood and testified, some nervous, some shaking, but all unwavering. The woman who had knelt beside me spoke first, describing how she saw Marjorie jerk my prosthetic so violently that my body twisted unnaturally. A father testified next, saying he grabbed his children and turned them away because he didn't want them to see something so cruel. Several others spoke in steady, determined voices about the harassment they'd witnessed over the past weeks, from the accusations about my parking to the intrusive comments about my mobility. And then came the final blow. The medical documentation, the ADA advisor's statement, and the long list of violation letters that made the harassment impossible to deny. The judge sat there, watching everything, his expression growing more disapproving with each new detail. When the evidence concluded, the judge folded his hands and looked straight at Marjorie. "Miss Blake," he said, voice firm yet controlled, "your actions were not only inappropriate and discriminatory, they were dangerous. You physically assaulted a disabled veteran. You publicly humiliated him, and you attempted to use your authority in the HOA to intimidate and retaliate against him. This behavior is unacceptable under any circumstances." Marjorie stared down at the table, hands trembling. She didn't even try to argue anymore. Her attorney leaned close and whispered rapidly, likely explaining that the only option left was a plea deal. And after a long, shaking breath, she agreed. The deal was swift: 18 months probation, mandatory anger management classes, 200 hours of community service, a restraining order preventing her from contacting me, and a formal apology filed with the court. But the consequences didn't end there. The moment the plea deal was finalized, 2 members of the HOA board stood and requested the court record reflect a separate action they planned to take. They announced that the HOA board had already scheduled an emergency vote, a vote to permanently remove Marjorie Blake from her position as president, a vote to bar her from ever serving on the board again, a vote to strip her of the authority she had abused so freely. The judge nodded approvingly, and just like that, the woman who had controlled the neighborhood with intimidation, fear, and arrogance lost everything. Her power, her title, her reputation, gone in a single morning. As the courtroom emptied, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't victory, it wasn't triumph, It was relief. The quiet, steady kind that comes after months of tension finally break. I thought it was over. I thought I could go home and start healing. But later that afternoon, as I sat on my porch, an email notification pinged on my phone. It was from the HOA board. Subject line, request for private meeting. And I knew immediately something else was coming. After months of chaos, the neighborhood finally sounded like home. No shouting, no threats, no violation letters taped to my door before sunrise. Just quiet, soft, peaceful, ordinary quiet. The kind of quiet I had dreamed about when I first moved into the community, long before Marjorie turned it into a battleground. For the first time since all of this began, I stood on my porch and felt something I hadn't felt in months: safety. The HOA board scheduled the private meeting for a Saturday morning. I showed up prepared for yet another conflict, unsure if the removal of Marjorie had really changed anything. But when I walked into the room, something was different. The board members, those who had once looked at me with suspicion or indifference, stood as I entered. One of them even extended a hand. "Before we begin," the treasurer said, clearing his throat nervously, "we want to offer a formal apology on behalf of the HOA. What you went through was unacceptable. We failed to protect you when you needed us." The others nodded, their expressions sincere. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd expected excuses, deflection, maybe even resentment. Instead, I was met with accountability, something that had been missing from this place for far too long. "We reviewed everything: your documentation, AD guidelines, state disability requirements," another board member added. "Your ramp and your designated parking spot were not only justified, they should have been approved without hesitation. Effective immediately, both are permanently authorized." The words hit me harder than I expected. Permanent, authorized, not questioned, not debated, not weaponized against me. Hearing it said out loud felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been taken months ago. I walked out of that meeting with a weight finally lifted from my shoulders. And the moment I stepped outside, I was greeted by the very people who had once stayed silent during Marjorie's attacks. Neighbors who had watched from porches. Neighbors who hadn't known how to intervene. Neighbors who now approached with hesitant smiles and warm intentions. One brought over fresh cookies. Another offered to help repaint my railing. A family down the street invited me to dinner, saying they wanted to make things right. Kids who had seen me fall during the barbecue now waved at me from their bikes with wide, relieved grins. The fear that had once clung to this street dissolved into something better: connection. And little by little, I realized something important. This place didn't just become safer. It became a community again. In the evenings, I sat on my porch and watched the sunset behind the rooftops, the warm light washing away the shadows of everything that had happened. I reflected on the journey, on how close I came to giving up, on how painful it was to be doubted, and how empowering it was to finally stand up for myself. I didn't reclaim peace overnight. I reclaimed it inch by inch, the same way I learned to walk again after the explosion. To everyone watching this right now, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have fought back, stayed silent, or walked away? If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, an abusive neighbor, or anyone who thought they could control you, share your story below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And before you go, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. It helps more people hear stories that deserve to be told. As for me, peace has finally returned. But just a few days ago, I noticed something strange happening across the street. New board members arguing, a homeowner filming something on their phone, and whispers about a complaint brewing. Something tells me my next HOA problem might be starting sooner than I expected.